Just checking. Are we live? All right. Hello and welcome once again to the On the Game live stream. We are coming to you from the third day of the Play the Game conference, and today we will be discussing the challenging facing countries and cities when hosting mega sporting events. And to discuss this, we have with us Jules Boykoff from Pacific University in the United States. Welcome.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Are you enjoying the conference so far?
Yeah, so far it's been really great.
Okay, great. So we heard your talk earlier today, and you've extensively covered the Olympic Games in different parts of the world. Is there some key things that you've taken away from the research that you've done?
Yeah, so I live in Portland, Oregon, which is just up the road from Vancouver, and that's kind of what put me on this trail. I went up to Vancouver, interviewed a number of activists that were challenging the militarization of public space around the Olympics. Vancouver had created a bunch of special laws to bring them in accordance with the dictates of the International Olympic Committee. One example is a special sign ordinance. You couldn't actually, in Vancouver, post any signs that were negative about the Olympics. So you could, if you, let's say you put a sign in your apartment that said, Vancouver Olympics, don't like them, the police could come in and tell you first, take it down. And if you didn't do that within 24 hours, they could enter your home and take it down for you. Just shows the power of the International Olympic Committee when they arrive to your city, how the cities have to adjust. So my friends were all telling me about this is amazing. This is all about repression. You should come on up here. I was writing a lot about state repression at the time. And when I got up there, I realized there was so much more going on besides the repression, which was amazing and really wild and extraordinary and intense. But there was also, it was a story about activism around the Olympics. And to get to your question, activists are responding to these patterns that I've seen then in city after city. I moved to London, I moved to Rio de Janeiro. I've seen for myself these things playing out in the city. And that is a lot of spending being done on the Olympics. It's sort of like, it's like Etch-a-Sketch economics. If you remember the Etch-a-Sketch, you write something on it and you shake it up and then you write a new number on it. That's basically how the Olympics function. They write a number when they say it's going to start, and then things start happening. They shake it up, put a new number on, and it's always higher. So that's one pattern. Repression, the suppression of dissent of activists who are raising questions. There is things like greenwashing, which is to say you care about the environment and that you're doing the right thing for the environment, but then doing very little actually. And as I mentioned, the militarization of public space. I mean, in London, for example, they ratcheted to the roofs of apartment buildings surface-to-air missiles. And do you want to know how they told the people about these surface-to-air missiles that had been ratcheted to their roofs? They slid a little piece of paper under their door saying, oh, by the way. And so I talked to people in London that were really, for a good reason, I think, freaking out. Like, wait, have you just made us into sort of a target, perhaps, by putting these on our roof? So those are some of the patterns that you tend to see over time.
Like a authoritative, almost, pattern of, like, how they implement the Olympics in the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens is, on one hand, the International Olympic Committee, the body that decides who gets the Olympics, they tend to prefer places almost that are willing to be authoritarian. You've seen the Olympics go to Beijing in 2008 and then just given to them again for the 2022 Winter Olympics. But what also happens, I think, at the same time is that democracies tend to become more authoritarian when they host the Olympic Games. Even places like Los Angeles, the Games of 1984, that has been heralded by a lot of people. I've heard it here at this conference as the success story, at least in terms of the money part. But I mean, the policing in Los Angeles, they had what were called Olympic gang sweeps. And so what you see time and time again is that local police bodies, local politicians, they treat the Olympics like their own private ATM machine, in a sense. They get all the money they couldn't get under normal political times to fund weapons and all sorts of new programs. That was certainly the case in Los Angeles in the 1980s when they had a police chief who was just really, really tough character, and he used the Olympics for this. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It really kind of both favors authoritarian governments and makes non-authoritarian governments more authoritarian in order to actually carry out the Olympics.
Right. So that's when the Olympics are taking place, or like, but what is and that is also the people responsible for the event, but what are the initial reactions among the residents of a host city when it's announced that they're hosting?
Yeah, usually upon the announcement, it's a spirit of happiness. You see almost every time people jumping up and down. Not everybody. On TV you see it, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like a cliche. When the city gets the Olympics, everyone's happy, they're jumping up and down. But the reaction in the city is really varied.
Yeah.
There are definitely people who benefit from the Olympics money-wise, and it's usually the really well-connected political elites, economic bigwigs, and so on. There's also people who get pushed even further to the margins. Tends to be poor people, people of color, and so on. But I would say that overall, the Olympics can be a really fun thing. I mean, I experienced this for myself in these different cities. In London, there was definitely what economists even call a feel-good factor to the Olympics. People feel good. It's fun. You're on the tube, and people are happy. I mean, there's no question. It's for real. People enjoy the Olympics. The party's fun. It's just sometimes the hangover afterward can be a real drag on not just a population, but on an economy and other aspects as well, like these laws or surveillance cameras or whatever that stick around and sort of become embedded in the everyday policing afterwards.
So does the perception of the game change leading up to the event and during the event for residents?
I think it depends on the city, but I would say that the general rule of thumb is that there's happiness, as you were indicating on the front end. Then some of the questions begin to get raised, and there's a little bit like, whoa, what have we gotten into? But then when the actual Olympics starts, typically the critical voices get brushed over to the side, even though they still exist. And people are there like, well, we're having the party, we might as well enjoy it. I do think that the dynamic has changed in recent years because, over the last 10 years or so, there's just become so much more public common knowledge about the Olympics and these sort of underbelly sides that we didn't talk about that much, 10, 15 years ago, or academics talked about in their tiny little offices with sport coats with those little patches in the sleeves, smoking a pipe or something. Like, nobody was talking about it so much in the public sphere. But, when it comes to the sports, I mean, that's the sort of trump card, if you will, of the Olympics. The sports are amazing. The athletes are phenomenal. And, I should say before I start coming across too much as like a grumpadelic academic with a knee-jerk built-in penchant for dismissing sport, that I actually like sports. I mean, I dedicated a huge part of my life to it. I played professional soccer for many years, was on the U.S. Olympic soccer team, played for the team. So I don't come at this as a grumpy guy. I actually was all in on sports, and then the more I started to learn about this machine that I had actually even participated in, the more I thought, wow, this is not all it's always cracked up to be.
Yeah, earlier this week I was talking to the hosts of Play the Game, and they are also very critical of many aspects of sport, but it's coming from a place of love, I guess.
Right, yeah, I think that's for a lot of these critics here that come here. It's because they want to make the sports that they're into or the larger systems better. They're not doing it to just have other people not like them or something.
Exactly.
They actually want to improve the world for people who are enjoying sports.
Yeah. You were earlier today, and now you're talking about this sort of anti-Olympic sentiment, and is that a new phenomenon, do you think?
Well, actually, when I was researching my latest book, I came across anti-Olympics dissent going way back to the early 1900s. And it's funny because a lot of the same issues were at stake. So let me give you an example. The 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles, there were people with picket signs outside saying, groceries, not games. You have to remember, this is in the middle of the Great Depression for the United States, or at the beginning of it at least. And so people were wondering, why are we spending all this money on a sports spectacle when there's real misery, in our communities? But there's also been athlete activism history that's gone way back as well. I think most people that follow the Olympics know about the case in 1968 when John Carlos and Tommy Smith put their fists up in Mexico City, and Peter Norman stood there next to him wearing a button, Olympic Project for Human Rights button, in solidarity. But the protest even among athletes goes all the way back. There's a fascinating case from 1906 in the Olympics in Greece there, where a guy named Peter O'Connor from Ireland was forced to compete for Great Britain because they had been in control of Ireland at the time. And Peter O'Connor was an Irish athlete, track star. And he arrived in Greece to participate, was told he had to participate for Great Britain, not happy about it, wins a medal. They hoist the flags up for the ceremony. He's so mad, he runs over to the flagpole, shimmies up the thing, pulls down the Union Jack flag, and holds up an Erin go Bragh Ireland Forever flag. So, I mean, this history, and his two buddies, by the way, stood at the bottom of the flagpole guarding it so that the police couldn't stop them. I mean, so what I'm saying is there's a longer tradition of both activism questioning the games and its costs and its opportunity costs, but there's also a really interesting history of athlete activism vis-a-vis the games.
So it's not new, but where do the sentiments stem from?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even though it's not new, I would say that there has been an intensification of movements pushing back against the Olympics in the last 10, 15 years. People in Toronto would probably not be happy that I said that, because in the early 90s they staved off the Olympics from coming to Toronto in 1996. People in Denver, Colorado might not be happy because in the early 1970s they had already been awarded the Olympics by the Olympic Committee, and they basically said, you know what, we don't want to spend our money on this. They got a referendum on the ballot and it was voted down, and so the International Olympic Committee had no choice but to move the Olympics to Innsbruck, Austria for 1976. So they might not be happy, but I would say that, I mean, with all due respect to their efforts, their approach to things has intensified over the last 10 years, where it's to the point now where if your city decides they're going to put forth a bid for the Olympics, there's going to be almost inevitably some dissent kind of questioning and challenging that idea.
Right. So you were showing us earlier today different examples of anti-Olympic activism, and it kind of manifests differently in different places. But are the issues that they're protesting the same?
I think that there are some continuities in the issues that they're challenging that I was laying out for you before. But you're absolutely right. It takes different form because, for example, there might be a more repressive police force in one city that would be something that people would be concerned about. There might be more spending in one place. Sochi, Russia, for example. They spent more than $50 billion on the Olympics, more than all previous Winter Olympics combined. So people were asking questions quietly in Russia about it. You know, you don't want to get tossed into a prison for a long time by being too vociferous. So I would say it depends on the city, depends on the culture of the country more widely, and that also affects how the protest cultures come to be. I mentioned Russia, right? It's a very dangerous business to protest in Russia against the government, and so you just didn't see as much of that in the country against the games, even though there was a lot of evidence that people weren't exactly thrilled about hosting those Olympics. On the other hand, a place like Vancouver, there's a really strong First Nations, Indigenous presence. And First Nations people took the lead in many ways in Vancouver. And one of the big slogans was "No Olympics on Stolen Native Land," because the area that Vancouver sits on is actually the land of the Coast Salish peoples who had never actually come to a treaty with the white people who came over. So it's unceded land. It's still, in a way, technically Coast Salish territory. So that's why that slogan came to be. Well, you wouldn't have that in London or something like that, right? So it's always different. In London, there was a lot of question about the sponsorships. I mean, one example is McDonald's, this sort of corporate behemoth that rolls in with their skinny little French fries compared to the British French fries, the chips that are, sizable. So like one group they're a hilarious group. They're called the Space Hijackers, and they created this large catapult that they brought outside of the Olympic Stadium area, outside the fence. And they were saying they were going to catapult chips, really good chips, into the people inside because they had to eat McDonald's chips because McDonald's is the corporate sponsor. And so, I mean, I would say in London, it was like more of a humorous approach to things and kind of going with the grain. Not everybody, but that was the sort of the spirit of that moment. So it very much depends on the sort of activist cultures, depends on the political history of that city. And that's where I think it gets interesting. You get different variation. But to your point, I think you're right. There are specific issues that animate the activists in the first place that tend to, in slightly different forms, pop up in every host city.
Is the event a good publicity? Is there a publicity momentum for activism during a large event like these? Is it like a possibility for activism to show themselves, be present?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think the media spotlight comes to your town when you host the Olympics, and so it does create an opportunity for activists to slide right under that spotlight. Sometimes people call it piggybacking, which is to say piggybacking off the Olympics and hijacking it for your own political purposes to raise your issues that you're keen to have people think about. So in a way, it's an opportunity. And we were talking a lot about sustainability at this conference, and one of the things that maybe has become more sustainable, maybe more than anything else at these mega events, is activist cultures. And they've been able to sustain themselves on almost no money, shoestring budgets, and yet they continue to pop up in these various cities.
Yeah. So in the aftermath of the games, are people generally positive about the effects that the games have had on their city, or what are the reactions after the fact?
Well, I think it all depends who you ask, and I think it depends on the Olympics. So let me talk about Rio for a second, since that's pretty recent. So I lived in Rio de Janeiro in the lead up to the Olympics from August through December 2015, and then I returned for the actual Olympics. So I got a pretty good idea of what people were feeling going into the Olympics. And there was a lot of pessimism. We can't forget that the president, Dilma Rousseff, was on the verge of being impeached. The economy was as bad as it had been since the Great Depression. I mean, there were serious issues, and most people were focused on those. And the Olympics were this thing like, oh, yeah, I guess we are going to host it. It's going to be a party for the rich. They had just hosted the World Cup, so they got a pretty good idea of what a white elephant stadium is. They're peppered all throughout the country. So they were not going to be fooled again. So even going into those Olympics, there was a certain distaste for them from everyday people, at least, that I spoke with. Now, if I went to like the Rio Olympic headquarters, everybody would have been gung-ho, of course, and extremely happy. Or if I would have gone to the nicest hotels in Rio, which I didn't, then I would have probably gotten a very different response. Now, after the Olympics, I think it became pretty clear pretty quickly that this was a not so great investment.
Across the board, or just in those initially critical voices?
I think across the board, because even people that I spoke to from the upper classes in Rio after the Olympics were feeling quite disillusioned by them. Again, though, I don't want to misinform, so I don't like go hang out in these circles, and I think that's one of the things about this conference that's really interesting is, on one hand, you get some of the leaders in sport that come to a mega event from the top. They're literally jetting in many cases, and they see the event from up here. My approach with my research, and I guess my life, has been quite the opposite, actually. So I come on the ground floor. I meet everyday people whose names we're never going to see in the newspaper, and I talk to them about how they're going to be affected. And so what I'm talking about with you is much more of a grassroots, ground-up approach, and maybe that's why it might sound quite different than other people who you might have on the show who come from up here. I think those people are doing just fine, and they might think the Olympics were a success. After all, Thomas Bach, the head of the International Olympic Committee, said that they were the most imperfect games, or some terrible way of sort of papering over the fact that it was a disaster for the everyday people of Rio. So I think those people get the microphone a lot. The people that I met there, they don't get the microphone. And so that's kind of maybe what motivates me a little bit too. I think that there's a sense of unfairness that ripples through your city when the Olympics come to be. And I think it could be fixed, but it's not, because powerful people don't necessarily want to fix it.
So, speaking of the IOC, applications, there are fewer applications to host the Olympics. What can the IOC do to change this?
Well, far be it from the IOC would not probably want my advice on anything, to be honest with you, and I'd be really reticent to give them any advice. But, the fact is, you're right, fewer and fewer cities are game for the Olympic Games. So I think if they actually want to get more host possibilities from democratic countries, then they're just going to have to really change things around in a pretty significant way when it comes to spending, when it comes to some of these other issues around sort of sovereignty, basically, when the Olympics juggernaut comes into your town. So, I mean, they just have to kind of get to the root of some of these problems, cut down on spending, rethink the amount of the size of the games. They become gigantic, and that's part of why they cost so much. So I have specific ideas that I think the host cities could really implement that would make the games better for them. So, for example, like taking the Olympic Village that is now built for every Olympic Games and having it be social housing instead of basically new apartments and condos that only rich people can afford afterwards, which has been the case certainly with Vancouver, with London, and then also with Rio de Janeiro, where the apartments were built up by a tycoon named Carlos Carvalho. And so, I mean, I think there's one thing you could do to make the games a little bit more equitable.
Yes. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone on Facebook for following us. We will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m. In the meantime, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at OnTheGame17. And of course, visit our lovely website, onthegame17.com. Have a great afternoon.